Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, a very warm welcome to all of you to the Business Standard Annual Lecture. We are indeed grateful to the distinguished audience here who have come from all over the country for responding to our invitation today to this function. The speaker today, ladies and gentlemen, needs no introduction. As Chief Economic Advisor over the last 4 years, Dr. Subramanian has left his deep intellectual footprint on almost all innovative economic thinking under this government, except perhaps one. As he leaves by the month end for his stint as a visiting professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, we in Business Standard are glad that India's Chief Economic Advisor will literally have the last word on his thinking about India's economic and fiscal roadmap on this very platform. We all can vouch for the fact that it's not only Mr. Arun Jaitley, whom he has referred to as his dream boss, who will miss his dynamism, energy, intellectual ability, and ideas. All of us will also do the same. Dr. Subramanian is the one who spoke about the twin balance sheet problem, conceptualized JAM, the Jan Dhan Aadhaar Mobile Trinity, a revenue neutral rate for GST, rationalization of removal of subsidies for the rich, universal basic income, climate change, focus on public spending, stigmatized capitalism, the list just goes on. His economic surveys were outstanding and have been genuinely recognized as one of the best ever economic documents ever produced. Dr. Subramanian's secret wish, as he told us recently, was to be a people's chief economic advisor. And I think the surveys played a stellar role in achieving that ambition. The latest survey, for example, had millions of visitors from all over the world. He also launched the government's online education platform Swayam, which became one of the most followed courses in India. One of Dr. Subramanian's fond wishes is to come back as CA of all states simultaneously. That seems difficult, but we do hope that wish becomes a reality. Prior to joining as the Chief Economic Advisor, Dr. Subramanian served as a Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute and at the Center for Global Development. He also served at the International Monetary Fund and the GATT during the Uruguay round of negotiations. He is also a professor at heart. He's taught at Harvard Kennedy School earlier and at Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Even before he landed the job of CA, Dr. Subramanian earned himself a reputation as one of the world's most distinguished economists with notable contributions in trade and development economics. Though eminently qualified in other respects for his job as CA, he had to learn how to fit into a world where politicians have a stranglehold. It involved a tricky balance of being a consummate insider, but also an outsider, expected to speak freely and bring in new ideas. It seems he's managed to score well on this front too, going by the unusually generous praise he earned from Mr. Jaitley in a Facebook post. In one of the several interviews he's given Business Standard over the past 4 years, and we are thankful to him for that, Dr. Subramanian said, and I quote, "India has to catch a train that left the station 20 to 25 years ago." This, he said a year ago. After today's lecture, we hope to get an idea whether the years have increased or decreased. So, ladies and gentlemen, the stage is set for the Business Standard Annual Lecture by Dr. Arvind Subramanian. Let's give him a big hand, please. Over to you, Dr. Subramanian.
First of all, let me thank all of you for showing up for this, what is going to be my last public lecture, and the Business Standard somewhat pompously titled this The Last Word. Nothing is ever the last word on the Indian economy. I want to profusely thank Shamal for those unnecessarily generous words. I want to thank, first of all, Business Standard, with whom my association goes back many, many years. Sometimes I think I owe my job of CEA to the fact I did all those columns in Business Standard which brought me to the attention, including some provocative columns I wrote against the powers that be as well. I think I should begin this by saying that business standard, especially under the fantastic leadership of Ninan, AKB as he's known, and now Shamal, have really set such high standards of Indian journalism, and noteworthy especially for the integrity of Indian journalism at a time or in a post-truth world where journalism around the world, but also in India, maybe is coming under scrutiny and being called into question. I think to avoid this kind of race to the bottom in journalism with all the consequences, I think we're beginning to realize, or I think we have to come to accept that good journalism cannot be sustained by commercial kind of considerations alone. I think increasingly we recognize it's a public good, and I think that it needs all the non-commercial support that it can. So I think it's very fitting that a business standard is supported by a very enlightened patron in Mr. Uday Kotak, who's of course not here. I was hoping he would be here so that he too could get a round of applause, but he's not going to get it. Maybe in absentia, we could give him a round of applause as well. It is also a great delight, as I'm delivering my last public lecture, to have as a discussant. Of course, Ninan is going to be one of the discussants. Ninan, I've praised you enough already. I think I should acknowledge it's a great honor and delight to be here to have Montek Singh Ahluwalia as a discussant. Montek probably knows this. If he doesn't, I think I should remind all of you that for all of us, economists with kind of even an iota of policy pretension or policy sense, if I may cheekily call him the suave Sardar of St. Stephen's College, he's been the trailblazer and exemplar for all of us economists. And Montek, you probably know that we're all basically wannabe Monteks, never going to make it as Montek, but always wannabe Montek. So it's great to be here, to have Montek in the audience. I want to make another confession, the last one before I begin, which is that I think I'm actually quite nervous today. I've done a lot of outreach and things, not because Montek and Ninan are the discussants, because Ninan and my friends in Business Standard are a bit anxious that I may not be able to hold the attention of the audience. The topic is esoteric. In Mumbai, you should come and talk about grubby money, but I'm not going to be doing that. I'm going to be talking about something a little more kind of policy wonkish. Montek and AKB, I can still change my topic to the grand bargain for Indian banking if you want me to. Happy to do that. I still have 2 seconds, but otherwise I'll continue with this. But if you have the stamina, maybe you could invite me for one last public lecture on the grand bargain for Indian banking, which I'm happy to do at some point. But it is a kind of esoteric topic. I think it's a very important topic. So I'm hoping that all of you will give me your attention. The challenge that Ninan has posed to me in Brexit term is that he wants more remainers than leavers in the audience. So I hope you will all remain till the end of the lecture. Otherwise, I won't get my supper. Okay, the topic for this is, if this were the first finance commission, and some gobbledygook that follows after that. And the first, the title is chosen because I do want to step back and ask how we should be thinking about center-state tax relations. What is the motivation for this? The motivation for this, of course, is that the 15th Finance Commission has been set up under the chairmanship of Mr. N.K. Singh. It has some very quote-unquote interesting terms of reference, what it should be doing, what should guide its thinking. And then, of course, it's provoked this big debate on whether it's a kind of technical debate about, whether in terms of how much money should be shared between the states, whether the 2011 or the 1971 population data should be used. I think that, as I'm going to argue, that's completely irrelevant. It's a kind of red herring, a distraction. I mean, but I think we should take this seriously, more seriously, not because of the kind of north-south divide that it seems to bring to the fore, but because I think some important issues of what I would call redistribution of tax resources have been raised, and I think those things need to be heard, listened to quite carefully, because I think we need to address these things in a more consistent, cogent framework. I'm very scared of saying anything against finance commissions, because Governor Garu, the chairman of the 14th Finance Commission, is here, and I'm always reminded of his saying that, if you say anything controversial, say it and check yourself into Just Look Hospital. So, maybe that's what I should do after this, after provoking him as well. So I think there's a fairness issue, but these are the kind of proximate motivations for this talk. This talk is going to be structured, I'm going to give you a bit of background. I'm going to talk about 3 developments: redistribution, devolution, the goods and services tax, and what I'm going to call the low-level equilibrium of the lower second and third tier of governments are not performing very well in India in terms of public service delivery and in terms of their own revenue collection. And so I'm going to talk about that. And I'm going to argue that, in a sense, these are 3 perennial challenges of fiscal federalism. See, one of the jobs of the chief economic advisor is kind of, I was on the plane with someone who said, your job has been and should be to kind of step back and present things in a kind of broader and bigger long-term perspective, and that's what I want to do. All that I'm going to say is kind of may or may not be inputs for the 15th Finance Commission. They may or may not be listened to, like a lot of advice I've given to the government, but at least we will have hopefully a framework about with which to think about some of these issues. And I think that it's also very interesting to understand India in a broader context, especially in the context of what's happening in the European Union. I think there's some important lessons there, may not be immediately applicable to India, but I think India must think about these things because something, really, see, remember, India is becoming, from many fragmented economic Indias, we're becoming one integrated India. From more centralized political India, we're becoming many quasi-sovereign political Indias. So economic integration, political federalization, how do you manage fiscal relations in this context? That's what I think finance commissions should increasingly be thinking about. And 3 substantive issues that come up in this context are: how should we think about redistribution? Equalizing transfers between states. How should we think about risk sharing? And this is what happened in Europe. One part of the fiscal union does badly because of a shock. How should other parts of the union respond? Should there be transfers across in response to what we call asymmetric shocks? And finally, should these tax sharing arrangements have some provision for providing incentives for better performance, and in the Indian context, better performance for the second and third tier? So these are the issues that I'm going to talk about in the next half an hour or so, and then Ninan and Montek can savage me to their heart's content. Okay, what is the background? I think the background to this Finance Commission, 3 new developments. Montek is here. One of his alma maters was abolished, and that means that center-state transfers now will largely occur via the budgetary process or via Finance Commission transfers. Governor Garu gave very, very radical proposals in the 14th Finance Commission, which had the impact of basically giving much more autonomy to states on the tax side and on the expenditure side. On the tax side, they got more revenues, 32 to 40%, 42%, and on the expenditure side, less, dictation by the center on what kind of spending the states should be doing. So on both sides, I think there was more thing. And the third development, of course, is the introduction of GST, which is going to have many, many interesting consequences for fiscal federalism. GST is integrating India, so economic integration is going to proceed faster. At the same time, it's reducing fiscal autonomy for both the center and the states, which should make you think about Europe. You get more integrated, therefore shocks spread much more, therefore you need more risk sharing and transfers. That's GST is doing both. And the GST is also having some quasi-permanent redistributive effects, as we had envisaged. You know, the GST is a consumption tax. We used to have kind of, excise was a production tax. That entails a shift in the tax base, and the early evidence suggests that some of that is happening. So these are the new developments against which we should be thinking about fiscal federalism and tax sharing arrangements. On top of that, we have some background realities. One is, this is what I call, there's no economic convergence amongst the states. You see per capita GDP rising, but you see the spread, so regional inequality is not declining. What that means as a background reality is that the pressure for redistribution, equalizing transfers will always persist. And that doesn't go away. And of course, what I said about decentralization. So against these background realities, against these new developments, that's how we should think about. And why I say first Finance Commission is because, you know, I think there is a sense in which one can start from a tabula rasa, think about a new framework, a new vision for how should we should consistently, economically, cogently think about some of these issues that have arisen. Now, okay, I'm going to talk probably about the most controversial issue, the most, I think, things that's come up in the context of these, you know, the debate that's been sparked by the 2011 controversy, population controversy, expressed by many of the southern finance ministers. And now, I've shown this table, and you're going to try and peer more closely at it, but the point of putting up this table is to convince you that you should be confused. You should not be able to read this table, because what this table is, it summarizes how 14 finance commissions have tried to distribute money between the states. There have been 14 different criteria, you know, gazillion weights. There's been a combinatorial explosion of possibilities in terms of how to do tax sharing. If this were a judicial process, and with my humble apologies to Governor Garu, if this were a judicial process, we would be tempted into saying, perhaps the jurisprudence is a bit inconsistent, is a bit incoherent, and basically, it's basically random. Now, the funny thing, of course, is that finance commissions in India, I think, are one of India's most respected, and rightly so. They are staffed by eminent people, they consult widely, very thoughtful and disinterested analysis, and that's why their recommendations are almost always accepted. But the irony, of course, is that, you know, the outcomes are great, but what goes into making the sausage, I still haven't understood. And I think this kind of table should convince you that it is a bit of a sausage, but you know, what comes out is still very good despite the sausage. And I want to argue that we should have a better sausage-making machine, a more cogent sausage-making machine. Now, what I'm going to argue on redistribution is something very simple, and I'm going to give you some evidence. Basically, we need to start as the benchmark, going back to the notion that these are revenues that are collected on behalf of the states by the center. The money that goes into what's called the divisible pool is actually money that comes from the states and the center, and in the first instance, they should go back to the states. That's what devolution is. But in fact, that's not what's happened. We've had a mishmash of criteria, jumbling objectives, different motives, and the sausage machine becomes incomprehensible. But we should start from this benchmark. Center collects taxes, it should go back to the states as the default. Now, how that should happen, that's a technical question, and essentially they should go back in line with the state's tax base. And then we do some numbers based on how do you estimate the tax base. It's a pretty robust result. So it's redistribution then should be after this, i.e. you say, this is the default, this should go back to states. However, we have a redistribution objective, therefore not all of it will go back. We will retain some for, you know, equalizing situation between the states. And that's how we should think about devolution and redistribution. First instance, give back, and then say how much or not we should give back based on other objectives. So we have some, we do some calculations, and here are some striking findings that we get on this. First, we find that in the aggregate redistribution under successive finance commissions, the number today is about 32%. I, as a technocrat, will not tell you whether that's high or low, because that's really a political decision. But what I can say is that this sharing, the redistribution component of tax sharing that finance commissions have proposed has actually been rising over time. Good, bad, right, wrong, not for me to say, but good, bad, right, or wrong for the political process to accept, for the finance commission to keep at the back of their minds when they do these things. So growing share, so rising redistribution. Second, what you find, and then you can do it in many ways, what you find, this is at the aggregate level. This is, for India as a whole, you could say, tax transfers under finance commissions have a huge component of redistribution. What does it mean for the individual states? We calculate this. We identify who contributes, who receives, and what you find is that the contributing states contribute quite a bit. One way of calculating how much they contribute is how much do they give relative to what they should have got, and similarly, the receiving states, how much they get relative to what they should have got. And what you find is that, first interesting thing, the political bombshell needs to be defused. This is not a North-South issue. The Vindhyas should not be the metaphor, both literally or geographically, as distinguishing benefiting states and receiving states, contributing state, benefiting states, because in fact, the contributing states are, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Punjab, Haryana, in addition to the 4 southern states. So this is not a North-South issue. The contributors come from everywhere. And of course, the recipient states are, the states in the interior, Jammu and Kashmir, and the Northeast. But what you do find is that, just as in the aggregate, what you find is that even at the level of states, at least for the southern states, their contributions are going up. Maybe that's what's contributing to some of the angst. And in terms of the receiving states over time, it is true that some of the hinterland states, especially Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, and Madhya Pradesh, are seeing a rising share of benefits. In terms of, it's often, the numbers are quite high, something like, I think this should be the right chart. What they're contributing, Haryana, Maharashtra contributing something like 70%. The receiving states, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, UP, getting something like 100%, i.e., they get 100% more than they would have got had you just stuck to the principle that states should get back what is their tax base. So we see high and rising contribution benefit ratios, which kind of underlay all of this. Now, these discussions of devolution and redistribution are going to be challenged because, why are you focusing on redistribution under tax sharing? We redistribute through other means. All centrally sponsored schemes involve redistribution. Minimum support price, freight equalization, etc., etc. So in India, of course, this is kind of the whataboutery argument. You focus on one and they say, but what about something else? But my point is twofold. I think tax sharing, redistribution under tax sharing is sizable, substantial, and must be understood for what it is, even though there may be other forms of redistribution going on. Because in these other schemes, redistribution is kind of a byproduct, is not the objective. And I would say the other reason, which again some might push back on, is that when you have redistribution through these other means, it is part of the political process, whether the budgetary process or otherwise. Whereas redistribution that takes place under the Finance Commission is a kind of, although as I said, always politically accepted, is pretty much a non-political, technocratic, quasi-judicial process. So therefore, we must understand much more clearly and be much more careful and aware of the redistribution that takes place under tax sharing arrangements this. So I think this is very important to understand that we have a high and rising level of redistribution going on under tax transfers, and the identity of the contributing and the recipient states is what it is. It's not a north-south divide, but these numbers are rising to high and probably for the contributing states to some uncomfortable level, which is how I read the population debate that's going on. Okay, I've done with redistribution. Topic number 2, 3 implications of the GST. This is a chart just shows how much of the state's taxes have been subsumed under GST and how much of the center's taxes have been subsumed under GST. Both have lost fiscal autonomy. But it's probably fair to say that the states have lost a little bit more fiscal autonomy than the center. Now remember, I should be very careful. I don't want to be misquoted. In a sense, there is not a pure loss of sovereignty. What the center and the states have done have come together to pool their sovereignty. So in that sense, it's a remarkable achievement, the GST, at a time when around the world people are reclaiming, countries are reclaiming sovereignty, whether on trade or immigration or the European Court of Justice, et cetera, et cetera. I think the fact that 29 quasi-sovereign entities and the union territories and the states came together to kind of pool sovereignty, it's quite a big giving up in the interest of a common good. I think it was a remarkable achievement of the GST. But we should not, in celebrating that, we should not lose sight of the fact that there are consequences for fiscal autonomy. The GST is going to curb, a state can no longer say, I have a sugarcane problem, I'm going to raise whatever the VAT on sugar. They can't say that anymore because now this has to be done jointly. So this fiscal autonomy, this kind of quasi-loss is a consequence, and it's very important for tax sharing arrangements because remember, again, India is getting integrated, shocks spread more easily within India, therefore you need transfer mechanisms. Point number 2, I don't want to belabor, essentially my latest calculations with my colleagues show that what's been remarkable about the revenue performance in the first 9 months is that if you do the arithmetic correctly, the system as a whole has led to actually very little compensation requirements. The center promised the states 14% for 5 years. I think we're almost already at a stage where compensation is moot, which means that the cess that was being levied, that also will have to be reconsidered at some point. And the reason I raise it is that if you do away with the cess, it will have implications for center-state sharing of taxes, but I don't want to go into that in any great detail. What I do want to go into, which I think is pertinent to the fiscal federalism debate, is that our analysis of the first 9 months shows that broadly, there has been a shift in the tax base towards the smaller states in the northeast, towards Uttar Pradesh, towards Rajasthan, the net consuming states. Broadly, there are some exceptions, and the ones that have kind of seen their tax base get reduced are indeed the big manufacturing states and some of the states that were giving special incentives in the hilly areas, as well as kind of Punjab, which had these unusual arrangements of taxation of agriculture. So again, what is the relevance of this? The relevance of this is that if you're going to get a shift in the tax base which is equitable towards the poorer states, that means that the need for redistribution under tax sharing arrangements will maybe reduced, but that's something that finance commissions will have to take into account. So we've done redistribution, we've done the impact of the GST. The last point I want to come to, especially in a city like Mumbai, where I don't know what the infrastructure, I hear various things about Mumbai infrastructure. It's probably symptomatic of, Ishar is not here, who's the expert on cities. But I do think that we should understand this better, and I think finance commissions and the tax sharing arrangements must keep this in mind. And I want to say one or two really some things that I feel very strongly about and challenge some of the conventional wisdom that the Indian ecosphere broadly has converged to on these kinds of issues. One, I think that the states and the third tier generate very little own revenue. if you look at the states, Indian states compared to other federal systems, they've generated very little. In India, as a share of GDP, it's been declining even. And similarly, the third tier actually is highly dependent on transfers from outside. So both states and the third tier rural and urban local bodies generate very little own tax, especially own direct tax revenue, which is critical for service delivery. Now, here's where the Indian conventional wisdom has converged on. When I say this, the immediate reaction is, that's because we haven't devolved enough power to the second and third tier bodies. As I'm leaving, I should be polite and temperate in my remarks. I want to challenge it. I think that is not right. How do we know that? We know, for example, nothing prevents the states from taxing agricultural incomes. Nothing prevents urban and local bodies from taxing property. In the economic survey, my colleagues, one of whom was on the Finance Commission, Anthony Syriac, did this very detailed work which shows that even relative to the potential that second and third tiers have, they undercollect. So it's not that they don't have powers which they can't use. Even given the powers, they significantly undercollect. They collect 10, 20, maximum 25% of their potential. So what this points to potentially is that perhaps there is a problem with the second and third tier, that they may be congenitally unable or unwilling to increase their taxes and tax base. This decentralization and proximity to the people, wonderful in some respects, might have consequences in terms of this inability to raise taxes, which can be deeply damaging in the long run, especially for our process of urbanization. One small aside on this, I'll come back to it. I am therefore coming round to the view, if this hypothesis of mine is right, that second and third tier will not be able to or willing to increase their tax, that essentially property can and probably only can and therefore must be taxed at the central level. So I think the income tax arrangement, when we think about that, I think land has to become a big part of the tax base at the center going forward, because the evidence suggests to me that it ain't going to happen at the second and third tier. Now, I don't want to get into this, but I think essentially what therefore this does, I think there is, at least this is a hypothesis of mine, there is a low-level trap at second and third tiers. Poor service delivery leads to poor low taxes, leads to dependence on external resources, which means accountability is weak, which then feeds back into poor services. So I think we may be stuck in a low-level equilibrium trap at the second and third tier with weak service delivery, which has certain implications for tax sharing arrangements, which I'm going to talk about in the next section. So redistribution, the impact of the GST, and finally, this low-level equilibrium at the second and third tier. What does this all mean for tax sharing arrangements, how taxes should be shared between the center and the states and between the states? So my own long-run vision for this is tax arrangements, the tax pot that's going to be shared between the center and the states. There should be 4 pots. I call them the 4 pots for revenue sharing. Pot number 1, devolution, the default. You give back what is due to the states, i.e. their share of the tax base. Then and these are all kind of quasi-political decisions. Then you decide how much redistribution there should be, how much you should set aside for risk sharing, and how much you should set aside for rewards or incentives to, in India's case, breaking that low-level equilibrium trap at the at the second and third tier. So let me run through these. I think that, these are kind of, in this redistribution question, when we think about redistribution, I think that, as I said, the background reality that there's divergence in performance of the states, per capita GDP incomes have not converged, always, my own view is that, my own feeling or my own perception is that all finance commissions are dominated, at least in terms of the sharing between the states, dominated by redistribution, redistribution, redistribution. And I think there's some validity to that because of this background reality. Fiscal capacities, etc., are very different. But I think when we do this, there is obviously a political imperative to meet. But I think that if you read between the text of what the southern states are saying, there is a sense that, let us not lose sight that there may be potential long-run costs to redistribution, which is you dent the incentives for better performance. So I think the political process and therefore finance commissions should be keeping this in mind. That's why I think there should be a vision for the future. Should we continue with 35% of devolved resources to always be redistributed? Should they remain the same? Should they come down over time? I think these things need to be decided. And those things will be determined by the political capacity of both the political imperative of having to redistribute, but also the political capacity of the contributing states to sustain these transfers. That's why I think this whole current population, at one level it seems absurd that anything in India should be done based on data 50 years ago. It's absolutely patently absurd. But I think that's irrelevant. I think what's more relevant is thinking about devolution and redistribution in consistent terms and how they should be given back. I also think that, this mishmash of criteria that I showed you, of finance commissions, 14 finance commissions, 14 criteria, lots of weights. I don't understand. Governor Garu has to, sit me down over a beer and explain these things very carefully to me. I don't understand what's going on. What I do think is that if conceptually you can distinguish these pots, then the redistribution pot can be based on simpler, parsimonious criteria. You don't have to put everything into the kitchen sink, into the sausage as criteria. Forest cover, one commission says forest cover, another says fiscal capacity, some says income distance. It's kind of, it's mind-bogglingly bewildering to me, but I'm sure better minds can understand this than I can. And I think one advantage of this would be to say, if you're going to do, if there's a pot for redistribution, then it should be determined by criteria of redistribution, which can be simple and parsimonious. So that's my long-run vision for redistribution. The risk sharing, I think that, and here I'm going to be a little bit technical. You see, one of the jobs for economists is to try and think about, the Indian economy in a broader context that I said. There is a rich literature of, how should countries deal with asymmetric shocks that are getting integrated and that are part of one currency. This was the heart of the problem in Europe. One currency, Greece getting hit, Spain getting hit, how much should Germany transfer or not? If so, how much and under what conditions, etc., etc. I think something similar is happening in India. We're getting more integrated. We've forgotten, wonderful, we still have one currency, but if you have one currency, then it has implications. The implication is that we know from the theory of optimum currency areas that the more integrated you are, you need stabilizers when there are asymmetric shocks between the regions. What are those stabilizers? One, labor mobility, which we have in India. The other is, if one region is doing badly, there needs to be a mechanism of fiscal transfers towards that region. In India, by the way, you can have asymmetric shocks between the states. For example, the discussions, when there are monsoons and droughts, you need transfers. The sugar cess now that was discussed in the GST Council is a good example of asymmetric shocks because a few states were affected by the sugar problem. But there can also be asymmetric shocks between the center and all the states combined. For example, if you have a financial crisis, for example, that affects the country as a whole, and given that it's the center's job to provide the public good of macroeconomic stability, the center should have the levers to raise resources. And therefore, we need risk-sharing arrangements. So my own preference, some people would say states and center still have enough autonomy to do this. And that may be valid. But I still think that when we're fashioning this consensus on fiscal federalism, maybe there should be a pot for redistribution so that you can collectively decide what should be the transfers under what circumstances. So that's my risk-sharing pot. The last pot is the rewards pot. I think we can resign ourselves and say, oh my God, we continue with the status quo. because nothing can be done. The Constitution maybe prevents us from, from the center and the Finance Commission to transfer directly to third tier. Or we can say that we must break this cycle of the low equilibrium trap and in fact provide incentives for better performance at the second and third tier. I think the part of the incentivizing can just happen by reducing redistribution. The more states get back for what they perform, the more the incentives to do well. So I think that's one way. The other way is you leave it to the center transfers to states, and states in turn transfer to the third tier. But that runs into the Raja Chelaya problem. Raja Chelaya said, everyone loves decentralization, but up to his level, not below. And so states seldom, they don't like to transfer political and fiscal power to the third tier. We know that from experience around India. So I think we have to find a way of maybe incentivizing performance through matching grants or some mechanism. I've not thought through all the details. I think we need to devote much more time to say, the third tier gets more money if it raises for every 1 rupee of resources that it raises, maybe it gets 1 or 2 rupees from the center. And that kind of matching grants, I think, but it's never happened before. It's not easy to implement. A lot of thought needs to go into it, and I think we must spend time thinking about this. So I gave you the background and the analysis, and I think my conclusion is that there should be 4 pots. The question comes up, how do you implement this? After all Finance Commission recommendations, all formula-based, no need for any kind of follow-up, it's just mechanical, you write checks depending upon how it happens. But I think in order to implement the vision that I have, you will need some new institutional structures. If, for example, you say you have to give matching grants, who is going to determine, how much money was raised by the third tier? Who's going to calculate that? And so on. And I think actually we do have now in the GST Council a forum which has shown itself to be a great forum for cooperative federalism. I think it is the natural forum to take up the tasks that finance commissions might set them in terms of implementing and following up with some of the suggestions I've made in terms of how this should be done going forward. Ninan, not one lever, all remainers. I want to end by saying, as I said, it's really, I think, there's so many things fascinating about India, going on in the last 20, 30 years. Why it's so exciting to be an economist studying on India. I say that, in my future avatar, I want to be Chief Economic Advisor for the center and all the states. But I also want to write another 20 economic surveys because I think India is so rich, throws up so many issues. And one of them is this, here's a process, before our eyes we see India becoming more integrated, one economic India. Before our eyes we see this, this great decentralization and federalization of political India. So, I mean, it's a remarkable opportunity for the Finance Commission and anyone else to think about how the fiscal arrangements should be commensurate, with these realities of this, wonderful changing India. That's why I said this is so exciting and so new. That's why I said this is the job of the 15th Finance Commission is really the job of a first Finance Commission. Thank you very much.
It was, as expected, truly an outstanding speech, Dr. Subramanian. I'm sure some of the issues that have come up today will be discussed and debated even in Mumbai, despite your initial skepticism. But now we come to the second stage of today's function, which I'm sure will be equally intellectually stimulating. May I now request Dr. Montek Ahluwalia and Mr. T.N. Ninan to join us on the stage. The next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, again, hardly needs any introduction, but for form's sake, let me do this entirely superfluous exercise. Dr. Montek Ahluwalia is a former Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission and was a key figure in the country's economic reforms. He played a crucial role in convincing the world that the reforms were for real and India would not look back. Dr. Ahluwalia has held several important positions, including Special Secretary to the Indian Prime Minister, Commerce Secretary, Finance Secretary, member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister, and many other important positions. He's also worked as Director of the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office, and his published works on economy show the innovative changes he has brought to bear on Indian policy making in the past. Ladies and gentlemen, over to Dr. Ahluwalia.
Well, thank you very much for a very generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me. You know, I want to join you in saying that was a really good lecture. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot, so many congratulations. We're clearly going to miss you as Chief Economic Advisor, and I hope your dream of becoming Chief Economic Advisor to all the states in some manner turns out to be correct. Now, you know, I'm told that there will be opportunities for questions. So having said that, we've had an excellent lecture. I don't want to go into a detailed sort of analysis of it, but just to make a few points, and maybe a little bit of provoking. See, first, I think he's rightly pointed out that in the past, finance commissions have got their agendas cluttered with multiplicities of objectives. It's very easy to add an objective. It's just a little bullet or an italicized number that you add to a list. The way finance commissions have gone about it is to actually devise a formula where these things are all just put in. The problem really is that in the end, nobody actually analyzes the rationale of the formula. What people look at is, what was I getting under the previous finance commission? What am I getting now? And I mean, if it's a big improvement, that's very good. That's really where Venu Reddy's, the 14th Finance Commission, made the biggest difference because it increased devolution. So everybody looked at that and said, well, we're going to get a lot more, and that's good, because they didn't factor in that the reason they weren't going to get a lot more is that some of the other channels through which money used to go isn't going to flow. Now, mind you, I think that was still a huge improvement because it achieved what the states had always wanted, which is flexible money. In other words, not money went through centrally sponsored schemes, planning commission, this, that, and the other, which was all tied up with conditionality of one kind or another, but simply money saying, you're sovereign, here's the money, go and do what you like. And I think that was definitely a big improvement, and I'm sure it will be very difficult for the next Finance Commission to make as big an increase in the devolution, simply because there isn't that much which the center can now give up. But I mean, they will also be under pressure to increase. But I think what Arvind's lecture points out is we need to be a little clearer on what is it that we're actually trying to do. And personally, I thought the 4 pots concept was quite an imaginative one, particularly making the distinction between what is actually simply returning the money that's your due, in the sense that for whatever reason, the center is collecting it, but it's due to the state, so we're kind of handing it back, and what's the basis on which that should be done, as opposed to we're using this transfer mechanism to bring about some degree of redistribution. Now, you know, the importance of redistribution in the Indian context should not actually be doubted, because as Arvind's already pointed out, I mean, a similar problem arises in Europe. You know, the difference, though, is that the internal inequality, income level differences in India are much greater than in Europe. I mean, the last time I looked at it, if you take per capita GSDP as the criterion, you have the richer states, let us say to Bihar, and the ratio would be 4.5:1. Most other federations do not have large units with such huge income disparities. So it's very difficult to believe that you can hold the union together without quite an explicit and built-in distributional criteria. I also agree that this population discussion is quite pointless. I mean, it makes sense to use the most recent population number. You know, especially because you can always offset whatever population number you use by the weights that you assign to that formula. So it's one thing to say that this is the formula and we're now going to change the population weight. Then of course we know who's going to benefit and who's not. But if all you're saying is, look, you go and work out your formula, but the numbers, population numbers should be this, that is simply not worth worrying about. We need to look at what's the amount of redistribution that you're targeting and exactly how are you redistributing it amongst the states. There's a huge variation possible there because, you know, you could take the view for any given total that the distribution pot should be small or should be very large. If the distribution pot is, let us say, very large, you could then be taking the view that, yes, there should be some progressivity, but not too much. Or if the distribution pot is very small, you could be taking the view that there should be a huge amount of progressivity. So quite honestly, by saying, I think by saying we have to distinguish between two pots, you're clarifying the issue, you're forcing people to look at what really needs to be looked at, and of course, Arvind's been very careful not to prejudge what is the role of the Finance Commission, which is to put numbers on these things. But I do feel that if it was done that way, it would allow a better discussion of whether the basic parameters have been rightly chosen or not. I mean, for example, you can, any distribution that, let's say on a per capita basis, gives more to the states that have a lower per capita income could be said to be progressive. But that slope could be very slow or very gentle, or it could be very steep. And that could make a very big difference as to who gets what. So that's one set of points. You know, on the other 2 points that he made, the other 2 pots, I haven't actually thought enough about the risk-sharing aspect. I agree that analytically it's valid, but you know, if I had to prioritize at this stage, I would focus a lot more attention on the first 2 pots and the last pot, which is the incentivizing pot, and kind of keep this risk-sharing thing for some happier day in the future, especially since finance commissions only have a 5-year period. And it's going to take another year or 2 before we are quite sure how GST is working. And also, it's not very clear what kind of a global situation we're going to face. So whether we are institutionally ready to build in a kind of risk-sharing element into the formula right now, I have a somewhat open mind. Incentivizing is actually quite crucial because it seems to me that if it's at all possible to build in an element into the interstate distribution which is incentive compatible in the sense that it encourages states to do more, raising their own resources, that will create the greatest long-term viability in the system. I mean, the ideal long-term viability, and this is a proposition for discussion I'm putting forward, one is that the growth process should be more convergent than it is. As you point out in the economic survey, and it was even pointed out earlier, so far in the post-liberalization period, there's been divergence. Now, frankly, I'm not surprised that in the early stages of a liberalization experiment, there will be divergence. I mean, simply because different states are differently placed, both in terms of their policy willingness to respond to the new environment, and of course, in terms of the state capacity to respond. So one can fully understand that initially, some states that were better placed moved ahead much faster. Doesn't necessarily mean that that's always going to be the case. And one other qualification Arvind mentioned, and that's migration. You know, migration has a very important effect in mitigating what may look like non-convergence in the gross domestic state capital, I mean production. Because what's happening is the faster growing states, people are moving from the less fast growing states, they're remitting money back home, and that's keeping consumption at home better off than it otherwise would be. So in the presence of migration, which is a very, very important factor, the measured convergence measured lack of convergence that you see in most of the studies, including the economic survey, they don't necessarily capture what's actually going on. But having said that, we need to keep in mind that just as we need a growth process that will make the states converge faster, or at least certainly not deconverge, and perhaps hopefully converge, which in the longer term will mean that the distribution pot becomes smaller. And somehow, if one can link that, if not within the period of a finance commission, but periodically. I mean, successive finance commission, if the principle were accepted, that this is indeed what we want to do, then I think successive finance commissions can say that, look, in terms of that particular pot, well, for the next round, these are the numbers that we proposed. I mean, I think it would be quite a useful thing to do. Now, there's one point, and then I'll stop, and that is, Arvind touched upon it, which is the issue of not enough resources flowing to the third tier. And of course, the Rara Chelea rule that decentralization up to my level, but not below, I think there's no way, one view would be that there's nothing that the center can do to devolve resources below the state level. But actually, finance commissions have devolved resources below the state level. Only thing is that they're relatively small. I mean, give grants to panchayats, etc. But if they can give grants to panchayats, and therefore the urban local bodies become just as eligible, then the principle's already been conceded. So if the principle, it can't therefore be a constitutional matter. Nothing stops the Finance Commission from increasing fivefold the degree of devolution. Of course, you'll get a howl from the states, but that would be a tough thing to do. And my own view is, especially in the case of the urban areas, I think we should consider, I mean, we should represent to the Finance Commission that they should look seriously at Arvind's suggestion, thus escaping criticism ourselves for making the suggestion. Look seriously at the suggestion that the Constitution allows you to make grants to a lower level. Previous finance commissions have made these grants. So the difference now is how big should the grant be? And I would have no hesitation, given the very, very poor resource mobilization that exists at the lower level, to increase that manifold. That will have lots of implications because technically that should all come out of, I mean, maybe could come out of a combination of the center's share as well as the state's share. And how much of that, again, is something the finance commissions could propose. So I think that those would be extremely valuable ideas that could somehow or the other be pursued. One point which I wasn't all that convinced about was the idea of the center taking over property taxation. I mean, there's a lot of theories, as you know, that property taxation ought to be leading to a visible generation of resources that is plowed back into the infrastructure of the same local area. Now, this is therefore an incentivizing problem. How do we get state governments to empower the local level bodies to have more sensible rates of property taxation? I think at the moment, the state decides the rate, although it accrues to the lower level. And one of the standard sort of good things that chief ministers like doing is either to abolish property tax or lower it hugely, and that really should not be allowed. So I think from the, one of the things to do would be to think of a grant which goes down to a lower level, and that grant is linked to the effort that is made at the lower level to improve property taxation. If you could do that, then I think you would come very close to an incentive-compatible way of generating resources at the third level of government. Thank you very much.
May I now request a Business Standard Chairman, Mr. T.N. Ninan, to come and address us.
I hope you made this to the Finance Commission, no?
Thank you, Shamal, and good evening, everyone. We've heard very stimulating and, in fact, interesting lecture by Arvind and some wise words by Montek, as ever. I want to be the journalist. So my first comment is that finance ministers in New Delhi usually come from the Rajya Sabha, or they are Rajya Sabha kind of people, like Chidambaram. Okay, he comes from the Lok Sabha, but essentially he gets his votes because if there's an ally with the DMK or ADMK in Tamil Nadu, so he managed to get elected. Otherwise, he'd have to come from the Rajya Sabha. So Manmohan Singh was Rajya Sabha, Pranab Mukherjee was Rajya Sabha, Chidambaram is, who else? Arun Jaitley is Rajya Sabha, of course. So finance ministers tend to come from the Rajya Sabha. Now, this is a very comfortable perch to be in because you're not accountable to anybody. You're there for 6 years. You don't have to face a voter anywhere. You usually face guys who are in jackets and ties. And you can deal with the grand macroeconomic picture with the advice of people like Montek, who also look at the grand national scene, and they've come from Washington and they're here and they can give you good advice, and then you form a budget.
I hope you're not going to come to this Deshi Videshi nonsense.
I haven't heard you. Now, if you go to the finance ministers of state governments, they are hardcore political heavyweights invariably, unless you get another Rajya Sabha type like Amit Mitra in West Bengal, who has done wonders for West Bengal's state finances. So now those guys in the states have their ear to the ground. They have constituents coming back at them all the time. They are not 3,000 kilometers away from the voter. They are 200 kilometers away from the voter. They have to face pressures that the happy Rajya Sabha member in Delhi does not. So the business of forming a budget in the state is radically different from the business of framing a budget at the center. And this creates many of the issues that Arvind has spoken about, and I think is at the core of your suggestion, quite revolutionary, and I think an inevitable suggestion that the center should collect the taxes and the states should do the spending. I don't know if it'll work, but let's look at what's actually been happening. The center has been collecting more taxes. Central taxes in relation to GDP, this government in fact has done particularly well. It's gone up from about 10.2% or so before this government came in, and it's risen to, in this year's budget, it's risen to about 12.3 or 12.4% of GDP, which is an all-time record. No government has collected so much in terms of taxes in relation to GDP than now. And a 20% increase in relation to GDP in your tax collection means that you've got 3.5 lakh crores extra to spend. And you can build lots of highways, power stations, whatever you want with that money. But what happens is that, as Arvind showed through his charts, what happens is that more and more of that money that's collected is already being given to the states progressively over the years, as you saw from one finance commission to the next. And some numbers that I put together show you how this has worked. If you go back to 2001, start of the century, total tax collection was about 15.4% of GDP. That has risen to 18.9. But if you look then at what's the swing between the center and the states, the center's share of expenditure has fallen from 15.4 to 13.3, while the share of the expenditure by the states has gone up from 16.8 to 17.9. So you can see the center's role in expenditure is coming down and the state's role in expenditure is going up. And this is what we wanted. This is what the Finance Commission has done. This is what everybody is arguing for, that money should go down to closer to the people, and that's where the spending should be. But what do you see as a consequence? You see the divergence. In Arvind's, I think, his first chart, where the gap, income gap between the different states was like this before, and now it's sort of become huge. So inequality is increasing despite more money being given to the states. And so I come to my first proposition, that devolution through the Finance Commission will not achieve convergence in incomes in states. This is a completely ineffectual tool. You are asking the Finance Commission to do far too much by saying address the issue of increasing inequality among states. It can't do it. And in my view, I don't know if it is at all doable. You look at other countries. You look at growing inequality in the UK between London and the south of England and the rest of England. It's growing. You look at Italy. Southern Italy is poor, it is still poor. Northern Italy is rich, it is still rich. You look at the US. A poor state like West Virginia remains what West Virginia has always been, despite migration, whatever you have. Look at the EU itself. You have that problem. So this theory of convergence, that incomes will converge, that development happens, is simply not happening, and the Finance Commission certainly is not capable of addressing this issue. Is there some other way of addressing the issue? Maybe there is. So far it hasn't happened. And if you ask the Finance Commission to do more of this, then you are setting yourself up for failure. So then you say the center should collect the taxes. Montek's already pointed out what happens on property taxes. If you say that money collected from the residents of Delhi and Mumbai as property tax should be taken and given to Gorakhpur. Every RWA in both cities will be on the streets, and no corporator is going to be willing to face them. Okay? The reason why the states don't collect the taxes that they can, whether it's land revenue or the power tariffs that they should be charging, is because the reason what I said, that those guys are too close to the voter. No. So but your solution of taking it away from 200 kilometers and putting it 3,000 kilometers away is asking for even more redistribution. At some stage, you will get a political backlash to that kind of redistribution. One of the reasons why I think finance commissions have not been controversial. Now, because of terms of reference have been raised in a certain way, it's become suddenly an issue for the headlines. But the reason why why everybody accepts a decision, the government accepts it, why people like Dr. Reddy are doing it, so you say, Baba, he knows what he's doing, so it's correct, is that nobody understands this in the way that you have presented it. If you tell people that half the money that you are contributing as taxes is being given to somebody else, you've got a 100% variation here and you've got some similar variation here. You're saying, boss, तुम्हारा आधा पैसा और कहीं जा रहा है. True. Okay? If that message is understood, I can bet your bottom dollar you will get a reaction. And then if you increase it even more, because divergence is growing, as you're showing, and then you say, boss, center must collect even more money and then redistribute even more, you're setting yourself up for a crisis. And I don't agree that it's not a North-South issue. It is a North-South issue. All your 4 southern states are on the contributing side.
But so are others.
No, they're not the only contributors, but all 4 are on the contributing side. And if you increase redistribution, boss, you're in for trouble. So, my sort of brief take on this is that incentivization also will not work. I think, Montek, your point that if you collect this much property tax, I'll double it.
That is the matching grants.
Yeah, you'll give a matching grant. in my view, incentives have failed. Because at the end of the day, the Finance Commission says fill the revenue gap. So the previous 5 years misdemeanors are made up automatically. It's like a family and you have a kid, and the kid refused to behave himself. Finally, you can't throw the kid out of the house, he's your kid. So it's your state, they're your people. So at the end of the day, if they haven't got the money, you have to do revenue gap filling, which means non-performance gives you more central money. So there is no way in which these incentives, no, you can come back, but there's no way in which these incentives will work. In my view, the disincentive is actually more powerful. We've done in the past, the RBI holding the escrow account, and if, let's say, the state government does not announce the power tariffs that it should, then whatever devolution taxes are to go to the state, you first withdraw the money for the power bill and give it to the DISCOM. So the state now has no choice other than do something. Now, if they don't, then you have a bigger crisis. But to my mind, the theory that you centralize tax collection is setting itself up for a bigger problem. Now, there are some other issues that you raised. Very quickly. Yeah, the sausage. The sausage is an interesting one. Because at the end of the day, what you're basically saying is that the criteria that the finance commissions have used are irrelevant. At the end of the day, the redistribution is taking place to a substantial degree, to a 100% degree, in fact, if you're saying. So what does it matter how many conditions you give them, how many criteria you want to watch? It doesn't matter. I think the issue today is not the criteria or the amount of distribution, but the fact that the center, you are getting a backlash now from the center. Because what do the terms of the 15th, the new finance commission, what do they say? They're basically saying the center wants to claw back. You will get points, credit points, if you follow my scheme. Or your performance on the central scheme will give you credit points. So the center, and then you want to undo some of what previous finance commissions have done. So the center is clawing back. Why? It's understandable. A total central budget of 24 trillion. 14 trillion goes to the states. What is the center left with? Now, it's entirely understandable that the central government will say, boss, ये तो बहुत ज़्यादा हो गया, तो थोड़ा वापस ले लो. So, in my view, you may be reaching the limits of devolution and redistribution. And since you have not solved the divergence problem, the variation in incomes, we have not, I think in your paper, it hasn't come through as clearly in your presentation today, but you tried a theory of everything to try and bring it all together into one composite approach. But I think we are now at a new phase in a way that's different from the phase you said, that you pointed out that we are ending a certain phase and we're getting a new phase. I think the center is now going to be trying to do much more vis-a-vis the finance commissions, and the 15th finance commission is the first example of that. So in my view, divergence and increasing divergence is at the heart of the issue. And if we don't find an answer to that, then we have a problem. Thank you.
Can I respond? But I want to respond to the two. Yeah.
In the discussion, we'll. Thank you, Mr. Ninan. Now it brings us to a very interesting segment now. There was one speech by Dr. Subramanian, following which Dr. Ahluwalia and Mr. Ninan had their say. Now the three gentlemen here will discuss some of the points, following which there will be an interactive session where you all can ask questions, and they will be the one to answer. Thank you.
My privilege and to respond to, first of all, thank you for very thoughtful comments, Montek and Ninan. I think that I'm still CEA. I cannot be as explicit as Ninan wanted me to be, but I do think that what I'm trying to say here is, look, let's get to grips with how much aggregate redistribution is happening, how much state level redistribution is happening, and we may be heading to a kind of unsustainable levels of redistribution. See, let me say, Montek's, kind of supported me in this, let's be analytical and et cetera, et cetera. Let me push back on this on myself and on your support for me. I think you could make a case, and Ninan implicit what you're saying, you could make a case that, the system works precisely because it's non-transparent, right? Therefore, by making it explicit, you may actually worsen, the political thing. So, in some senses, I might have been irresponsible as a chief economic advisor by raising these questions. So there could be a kind of counter view. But I do think in the long run, there must be transparency, because people are making these calculations in the states themselves. Whether or not, you want to be explicit about it or not, let's just, grapple with these, confront these in an analytical, cogent manner. Now, I want to push back on the two items, or mainly the one thing or two things that both of you pushed back on. On this whole question of property taxation and the third tier and the too close, too far. I think we're all agreed, and it's a question that Montek, I want you to agree on this, is that all of us are believers in decentralization. We want that. But the evidence is that the closer you are to the people, you are not going to tax. Now, so you may not like property taxation in the center, neither do I. But if it's not going to be taxed at all, what is the improvement, the marginal improvement, as it were? And Ninan, to your point about, you take it 3,000 miles away and you redistribute, there'll be more chaos. I have a simple answer. My answer is, and it's consistent with your other point, the center does the tax collection, but you give it back in line with the tax base, i.e. you don't give it back as...
You mean you don't redistribute?
Yeah, you don't redistribute that. You collect, but you don't redistribute.
Okay.
And that's the way we square all these circles. That's one point. Second point, Montek, is, see, finance commissions have, as you said, have started giving things to the third tier. But they have been doing it more for, and Governor Reddy can correct me on this if I'm wrong, I think they've been doing it more based on procedural things. You improve your something capacity, your data, your procedure, you'll get more money. The proposal that I have is actually, it's not been done by any finance commission, which is that you have to make this forward-looking. You say, tomorrow you do X, you will get Y from the center. That's never been done. Finance commission's incentives also, even the famous, Kelkar commission, which said, more revenue collection, you will get money. It's based on past revenue collection, not on future revenue collection. So implementing this, which I think is necessary, and all of us are agreed on this, and Ninan, Ninan has a point. I don't disagree that it's going to be difficult to do, but I think we need to do this because it's terribly important. But it is going to be a departure from how finance commissions operate, because it's going to be done on forward-looking behavior. Therefore, you need some monitoring, measurement, and it's not formulaic. Finance commission comes, gives it, and goes on, and someone in the finance ministry writes checks based on mechanical criteria. You need a new institution like the GST Council says, Mumbai collected X more in taxes, therefore we get the data and we do it. So implementing it is going to be difficult, but we all agree that it needs to be done, and we also all agree that it has to be linked to their own revenue-raising performance, because we don't want a situation where just because they don't collect, we give more money, and then it's the same redistribution at the state level, which we transfer to the third level. So I think we need to be clear that I'm not recommending property taxation because that's desirable, but tell me what's the option. If you're close to the people, Montek, they're collecting, Jaipur is collecting 5%, and that's an overestimate in terms of its true potential based on satellite data. Being too close to the people is a problem in Indian taxation. We need to find ways. That's why I'm removing it, but not redistributing it, but giving it back as devolution. So I think that's the...
on the business of the center does the collection and hands it back. what on earth is the need for the center to do? I mean, who's determining the rate? Who's determining the valuation? The idea that some central mechanism will go down to every city, collect a whole lot of taxes and give them back to the city, I mean, what on earth is achieved?
No, but the way I would do it, Montek, is very simple, right? I think property would be a part of some indirect, the tax base. Then the devolution amount should take into account what the tax base of the different states are. And that tax base can be, GDP, income, and property prices. So, I mean, it's a technical issue.
So you mean the property tax doesn't go back to the actual locality?
It can't. It does, yeah. But it goes.
Then I think you'll have all the problems.
No, but you can give it back as matching grants.
Anyway,
it's worth considering. Yeah,
interesting.
exactly.
Fair enough.
I agree with Montek that there's a doability problem. I mean, if you look at, I know the Delhi property tax situation. You introduced
landed gentry of Delhi.
No, I'm not. I'm not. But my wife may be, but I'm not. You introduced a new form of property taxation in Delhi, which was more sensible than the previous one, but introduced 15 years ago. Over 15 years, you have not raised the property tax rates. So something that is valued in the market at 15 or 20 crores has a property tax of 15 or 20,000 rupees. And then even that is voluntarily assessed. There is nobody from the Delhi administration or the corporation which checks to see have you paid according to what you should be paying. It's just voluntary and nobody ever checks.
But you're supporting what I'm saying.
In the absence of all records of what it should be, there is no way a center can impose a property tax.
Satellite data. Questions, I think. Time for questions, right? Is it okay? Shamal, time for questions? Yeah? Huh?
I think there are lots of people wanting.
Yeah.
Why don't we come in if there are no questions?
But by the way,
challenging the
I just want to one thing, Montek. I think that you're absolutely right that when you look at divergence of states based on GSDP, you don't account for the remittances that go back and forth. But in the survey, we also calculated divergence based on consumption data, and it pretty much is consistent with the data. So you're right, remittances probably do have an equalizing, but certainly from the consumption data, not enough to kind of really reverse the process.
Arvind, the other problem is that if you say the center should collect do more of the collection, you increase your problem of who bears the shocks. Because you're taking away even more autonomy, fiscal autonomy from the states.
No, but
so then their ability to deal with the shock is reduced even more.
But Ninan, the autonomy that they have, they're not using. So what are they giving up? They're not taxing property.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the last segment of today's function. Now it's your turn to ask questions. Please mention if you want the question to be asked by a specific person here. Questions, please.
Sir, the Constitution promises to secure for every citizen justice, economic, social, and political. That's the way it's worded. And the Finance Commission is a tool of the Constitution to secure economic justice. Now, given that, can you not think of a different way of approaching the subject of distribution taxes? That is, on a common minimum program. The GST Council gives us an opportunity to have a common minimum program. We are signatories to the Millennium Development Goals, which means abolition of eradication of extreme poverty and hunger and gender equality and child mortality and all that. Now, if that is the kind of common minimum program, funding should go towards those goals first and then towards other goals in the common minimum program. Why do we have to reward people who give subsidies for any cause that politically elected state leaders decide to give? Why should there be not intergenerational justice when somebody preserves forests for future generation, for the water supply, etc.? So a different way of approaching it, if on the basis of efficiency and effectiveness of expenditures by the center and the states.
Can I, I think this question raises the issue. I mean, are we in favor of some kind of genuine federalism, which implies that sovereign states get some money, and then if they are sovereign states responsible to the people, they spend the money as best they can, and if they don't do a good job, they don't get re-elected? Or are we in favor of sort of paternalistic centralization? I mean, the Millennium Development Goals is some kind of 31 different or 17 different, I forget which, goals somewhere. They don't actually, they're not reflected in any political, constitutional sort of target or document or whatever. We have our own targets, but you cannot, I don't think you can simultaneously say that we believe that we should be empowering the states and say that all devolution will be linked to achieving goals according to some priority or the other. I mean, I'm not saying that, these are two equally internally consistent ways of doing things, but to describe or prescribe how devolution should go to what objectives is running a bit contrary to the idea that federalism means you let these sovereign governments choose the millennium goals which their electorate wants them to choose.
Correct.
And I think that's the issue, isn't it?
Right. I completely agree with Montek on this. In fact, I should say that, what I found very appealing about the 14th Finance Commission recommendations, this is kind of my spin on this, which Governor Reddy might completely disagree with. I think, in fact, what had happened over the last 40, 50 years, political power more and more de facto and de jure has been going over to the states. Especially with the breakdown of the monopoly of the Congress, politically the state parties became prominent, they got more levers of power, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then this process of decentralization, federalization was seen more and more in our fiscal arrangements, but then for a 5 or 10 year period, I mean, Montek will know this better, we had a kind of reversal of that process via the centrally sponsored schemes, which basically were a kind of a step back, essentially in the centralizing direction. And I think what the 14th Finance Commission did was to actually correct that aberration and go, give, facilitate and assist that process of greater decentralization, by basically giving those who've been elected and who are closer to the people that elected them more spending power and more tax power. I mean, I think that's, to go counter against that, I mean, again, this is not a value judgment, and Montek put it very well. It would be to actually go against the flow and the evolution of India as a political federation.
Let me just add one thing to that. The 14th Finance Commission, and Venu, your name is coming up so often that I think we should allow you to say something, either to say we're all wrong or a bit right or whatever. But I think one of the key things to remember is that the terms of reference of the 14th Finance Commission carefully excluded any reference to the Finance Commission must look after the center's need for its own plan. I mean, that was a conscious deletion. As I was then Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, I agreed that we shouldn't have this reference because my guys said, look, there's a big difference. You're not telling the Finance Commission to look after our need to finance a plan. And I was saying that, look, that should not become the reason not to do devolution. And clearly, once they went as far as they did, and I'm glad they did, the obvious thing the center had to do was give up all these things. So it was part of as you say, it was a response to a political decentralization that had in any case taken place.
Exactly.
And that part, what worries me, by the way, I just want to add this, in all of this is being, one of the key assumptions about good sense prevailing is that fiscal limits will be observed both by the states and by the center. And my guess is that they will be observed by the center. I'm not so sure what's going to happen at the state level, because the frequency with which loans, etc., are being written off is going to lead to one of two things. I mean, either the banks are going to say that, look, everybody whose loan has not been fully written off is actually a defaulter until his loan is written off. So the state governments will say, I'll write off your loan in the next 5 years, and for that 5-year period, this poor guy doesn't get any loans. Or they will say, come back and ask the central government to intervene. Then there will be a big issue of how do we handle this problem. So quite frankly, all this talk about fiscal incentives and this, that, and the other, this has to be grounded in the assumption that both the center and the states will live within their fiscal limits. The problem with I'm sure the center will, simply because we are a more open economy, and the pushback will come very quickly if it looks as if we are not. At the state level, you could very easily have a highly sort of disturbed expenditure patterns, where you're writing off loans and as a result you can't pay salary.
Montek, it's a somewhat controversial thing you've said. I mean, I used to say this as well, but I think that, the pushback will come from Governor Reddy himself, who will say that, look, actually there's an asymmetry here, that, the center can control the borrowing of the states by basically not allowing them to borrow, whereas there's no real similar counter check on the center, apart from all this wishy-washy, we're open, therefore there'll be, pressure on us, etc. So I'm not saying who's right or wrong, but the old view that I used to have that, centers responsible, states are not, I may or may not be true, and also what the checks on each are. There is, I think, a fundamental asymmetry, which I think we should lose sight. Yeah.
I think Dr. Reddy wants to.
Yeah.
I can just.
Governor Garu, 2 minutes for you.
Pardon?
No more than 2 minutes.
No,
then I'll check myself into just look.
Less than that. I think it's very, very provocative, and I'm going to write a book.
Okay.
From now. I'm not joking. And I think.
Challenging me or supporting me?
Not challenging, supporting you, clarifying.
Clarify, okay.
My own for myself.
Okay.
And I'll try to do it in the next 4 or 5 months, because it's not very difficult, I think. The second, for everything that we say, discuss, please look at the empirical evidence.
Please look at?
Empirical evidence.
Empirical.
Second, my limited point, states are irresponsible, correct. Look at last 30, 40 years. What was the reasoning? What was the reasoning? Please look at their performance. Revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, anything. 3, states do not know how to conduct, collect taxes, etc. India consists of states and something called union territories. Please check up how the revenue is collected in the union territories by the central government. The central government has its own machinery. Please check up what is the cost of educating a student. Please check up what are the subsidies. So from the state's point of view, they say, before you tell me what to do, please tell me what you are doing in the territories that you are administering. Which program have you done better than the average state? Which program? Take the cost per I'll stop. 1 minute is over. Thank you.
I think Mr. Chavan may want. Mr. Chavan, would you like
Mr.
to come
Chavan?
in?
Yeah, the lady there, please.
My name is Arvind Chari from Quantum Advisors. Dr. Subramanian will miss your economic survey, but given what we heard, you will miss it more than anybody else, so hope something gets you back quickly. My question is on fiscal autonomy, decentralization, and the issue of universal basic income. And there's a very nice trend in the US where it's not the federal, not the state, but the cities which are experimenting with some form of universal basic income. I'd like to hear your views on that, and whether India will announce UBI going up to the run-up to the elections next year.
Yeah, can I? Yeah, I think that's a terrific question, and it is true, for example, that not just on basic income, but even on the environment, for example, it's the cities and the states that are taking the lead. New York under Bloomberg took all these things. But I think, how is it going to happen in India? See, my own view is that the notion of a universal basic income is slowly gaining traction in India. As long as you don't interpret it strictly as universal, qua universal, as in everyone should get. I think if you think of it more imaginatively as a quasi-universal basic income, i.e. a large fraction, maybe excluding a few rich denizens, including of this big city, are excluded from that. I think we are seeing progress on that. For example, I've just written recently that if you take, for example, what's happening in Telangana, this Raitu Bandhu scheme, it is a kind of embryonic universal basic income, because essentially once you can identify people based on certain clear criteria, in this case, for example, it's owning land, everyone owning land gets a basic income. Now, what Telangana has done has a lot of problems. For example, it's not replacing existing ones, therefore it's going to add to the fiscal burden. Second, also, you see, you have to be clear what Telangana has done. It may be good agricultural policy, but it may not be good social policy because it's highly regressive. You get money depending upon your land owning, so it becomes a bit regressive. But I think more and more in India, this will happen. You will see experimentation. I was recently with the state chief minister who actually said, we are not able to implement the plethora of schemes that we have. We'd much rather have, provide this direct benefit transfers, and more will catch on. But I think my last point is that the beauty, I think, in India on this, which comes back to fiscal federalism, is that the center and the states can, will, and must cooperate even on this universal basic income. For example, Jammu and Kashmir was toying with the idea of this, but in this creative manner. So for example, suppose one state wants to implement universal basic income or some variant of that, it can tell the center, look, I don't want any more money from you than what you already give me, but don't tie, quote unquote, the money that you're giving me to Manrega, this subsidy, that subsidy. Untie the aid, let me do what I want, and then we will see more such experiments happening. And this kind of cooperative federalism, I think, is actually the way forward also more and more in terms of implementing schemes like universal or more realistically quasi-universal basic incomes.
Yeah, the lady there in the middle.
Thank you very much. I have two very technical questions. The first one is, if this were the first finance commission, why is there no focus on the penalties for breaching the fiscal targets? We have seen soft penalties where access to additional funding can get restricted if the interest serviceability of debt is not adequate, and two other such things. But there are no hard penalties for breaching the FRBM targets on states. Is that a point that is being discussed in the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission? The second is assuming that the role of Finance Commission is not to achieve convergence. And that is why redistribution is not the way to go. In that situation, are we essentially saying that the role of cess, which is not a part of devolvable taxes, is that going to become a bigger part of revenue for center plus states combined? Thank you.
Yeah, sure. See, there are hard penalties on states. If, for example, states breach their, FRBM / their own targets, let's say the target is 3% of GDP. If they breach that, the center can squeeze the funding that, because they cannot borrow. The center can say, we will not allow you to borrow from the states, and that's a hard budget constraint that can be imposed upon the states. So we do have hard budget, and in fact, Governor Reddy's point in the past has been that states have hard budget constraints, but often the center doesn't, because there's no one above the center to do that. On the cess, it's a very complicated issue. Yes, it's outside the devolvable resources. We know the pros and cons. I think that what happens is we know it's not desirable, but we know that when push comes to shove, and I think this would be another pushback by the states to the center. You say all this, discipline, etc., but at the drop of a hat, if you need money, you impose a cess and do that. So I think in principle, there are no limits on how much the center can impose cesses. It has to be part of good practice, good fiscal practice, good policy to do that. But I think it's honored as much in the breach as in the observance.
We'll have time for just one or two more questions. Yeah.
I find there are, two debatable points. Started initially with comparison of European Union and India. Whereas I think Indian Parliament is much more powerful than European Parliament. And here the interests of states are overlapping, and there is a possibility of synchronizing the interest of center and states, provided the government is a little apolitical. That is a debatable one. Second one I see is the potential for property tax. Suppose if I have a residential property in Kolhapur or in Bombay, the utility to me is same. But since market value is higher in Bombay, if you want to tax on the basis of market value my property in Bombay, how is it possible? Because I cannot monetize the value. If it is a residential property. If you are talking about commercial property, that is entirely a different issue. So I am a little doubtful about the potential for raising resources based on properties. Thank you.
Anybody like to take it up?
You know, obviously there are differences between the EU and India. There's similarities, there are differences. You know, I think, you know, if you want to answer, please feel free to answer. I didn't quite understand the point about property taxation because, after all, residential property taxation, after all, you know, in the US, you know, where we live, for example, the third tier in the US, in fact, most of the education comes by taxing property, and there's no problem. You know, you value property, you see what the market value is, and people pay for it. The difference is that people are willing to pay it because they see they get some service in return, some very good service. In India, for whatever reason, you know, and that's my low-level equilibrium trap, that residents are not willing to pay, in part because they feel they're not able to see the service delivery in return, and in turn, I think politicians, being too close to the people, are disinclined or unwilling to tax, and that creates this low-level equilibrium. But in principle, technically, I see no reason why you shouldn't be able to tax residential property like you do commercial property.
Thank you. That brings us to an end to this today's function. I must thank the three gentlemen here. The quality of discussions were really indeed outstanding, and thank you all very much indeed for taking time off from your busy schedule to share your time with us. I would now like to invite all of you to join us for cocktails. Thank you.